The transmission came in at 0300 station time, and I was the only one awake to receive it. My name is Devra Mail, and I had been a junior diplomatic attaché for the Human Continuance Mission on Conclave Station Velorith for 11 months. I had learned, in those 11 months, how to keep my face still, how to nod at the right moments during council sessions, how to eat food that tasted like wet clay, and smile while doing it. I had learned the particular silence that aliens expected from human representatives, deferential, patient, slightly grateful. I had performed that silence every single day. The transmission was flagged Priority Red, which was a classification I had never personally seen used before. It came from the council's own broadcast channel, not a private message, a public broadcast, the kind they sent when they wanted every listening station in the conclave to receive it simultaneously. I opened it. The recording was 47 seconds long. I watched it once. Then I sat very still for a long time. Then I watched it again, because some part of my mind refused to accept what my eyes had already confirmed. The footage was from a station I recognized, Outpost Merath 7, a small humanitarian relay post near the Dunori corridor. I had never been there, but I had read the mission briefs. It was staffed by 3 people, a supply coordinator, a communications officer, and a field medic. The medic's name was Lyra Son. She was 19 years old. She had graduated from the Nairobi Medical Institute 14 months ago and had volunteered for the Outer Station program because, according to her personnel file, she had wanted to help people who were hard to reach. In the footage, Lyra Son was standing in a corridor aboard a council enforcement vessel. She was wearing her medic's uniform. It was torn at the shoulder. Her hands were bound behind her back with a restraint cord. She was not crying. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that I can only describe as deeply, exhaustedly calm. The kind of calm that comes not from peace but from having already understood everything there was to understand about a situation. A council enforcer read the charge aloud. Lyra Son had been present during a sanctioned population reduction on the 4th moon of Dunori. She had administered treatment to members of the condemned population. She had transmitted their biological data to a human continuance emergency archive without council authorization. Under Conclave Directive 7 Theta, interference with a sanctioned purge carried a mandatory terminal sentence. Lyra Son said nothing. She did not beg. She did not argue. She did not even blink particularly fast. The sentence was carried out on camera. I will not describe what I saw. There are no words in any language I know that would make that description useful or necessary. What I will say is that it lasted less than 10 seconds, and that the enforcer who read the charge did so with the same tone a clerk might use to announce a filing deadline. When the recording ended, I sat in the dark of the communications room for a while. The station hummed around me. Somewhere down the corridor, I could hear the faint ticking of the atmospheric regulator cycling through its nightly check. I filed a receipt confirmation for the transmission, because that was protocol. Then I opened a secure channel to the Human Mission Director's quarters and sent a single-line alert. Then I sat back down. A man named Callum Voss arrived 8 minutes later. He was still pulling on his jacket. He looked at my face before he looked at the screen. "How bad?" he said. It was not a question. I played him the recording. He watched it without moving. When it ended, he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides. Then he walked to the communications console and opened the encrypted relay to Earth. He typed a message that was, in its entirety, 7 words long. I did not read what he typed. It was not my clearance level, but I saw his hands on the keyboard, and I noticed that they were not shaking. They were very, very still. The reply from Earth came back in under 4 minutes. Given the signal delay across that distance, that meant the reply had been prepared before the message was sent, which meant Earth had already received the broadcast through its own monitoring channels, which meant they had been waiting. Director Voss read the reply. He closed the channel. He turned around. "Get some rest," he said. "We have a full council session at 0900, and I need you sharp." I looked at him. "That's all?" He looked back at me. His expression was something I had not seen on a human face in a long time, at least not a human face in a diplomatic setting. It was not anger. Anger was hot and visible, and it moved. What was on his face was something much older and much colder than anger. It was the expression of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. "That's all," he said. I went back to my quarters. I did not sleep. At 0900, we attended the council session. 7 species, represented by their elected voices, seated in the curved chamber of Velorith Central Hall. The architecture was designed to be impressive, and it was, if you cared about that sort of thing. High vaulted ceilings, light panels tuned to a color that the majority species found calming. Seating arranged so that the Council of 7 faced the assembled representatives of 12 other civilizations, all of whom had various degrees of economic and political dependency on Council goodwill. Humanity sat in the second row from the back. We had been in the second row from the back for 23 years. The session opened with a standard agenda review. Trade ledger updates. Border protocol renewals. A minor dispute between 2 member species over mining rights in a contested asteroid belt. No one mentioned Lyra-san. I sat beside Director Voss and watched the council members speak, and I noticed something. They were not nervous. They were not watching us from the corners of their eyes the way people watch someone they have wronged. They were entirely comfortable, relaxed, even. The Velorith Council had broadcast the execution of a human child across the entire conclave network, and they had come to the 0900 session and reviewed the trade ledger and discussed an asteroid belt, and not one of them had the look of someone waiting for a consequence. That told me something important. It told me they did not expect one. After the session, as the chamber was emptying, one of the council's secondary liaisons approached Director Voss. His name was something I could not pronounce without practice, and he had chosen an unpronounceable title to go with it. But his role was essentially that of a senior bureaucrat responsible for human affairs. He was smiling, which on his species meant the facial plates around his jaw were loosened rather than tightened. It was, for them, a gesture of superiority. He told Director Voss, in very measured and polite language, that the council hoped the human mission understood the necessity of maintaining order within the conclave's jurisdiction, that the directive had been applied even-handedly, that no disrespect had been intended toward the human species as a collective, that the council remained committed to the ongoing partnership with humanity, and hoped that the incident would not create unnecessary friction. Director Voss listened to all of this. He nodded at the appropriate moments. He thanked the liaison for his time. As we walked back to the human mission offices, I asked him what he was thinking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm thinking about how long it takes to build something so large that people forget what it's sitting on." I did not know what he meant, not yet. Back in my office, I found that a second message had come through the encrypted relay from Earth. This one was addressed to me specifically, which had never happened before. It was a single line. It said, "Keep your eyes open and write down everything you see." I pulled out my personal log and I began to write. I wrote down the 47 seconds of footage. I wrote down the liaison's speech, word for word as best I could remember it. I wrote down the way the council chamber had smelled, like recirculated atmosphere and something faintly raw chemical that I had never been able to identify. I wrote down the sound of the atmospheric regulator ticking in the dark at 0300. I wrote down Lyra-san's face. That face, steady and exhausted and 19 years old. I wrote it down with every detail I could find words for, because something told me that it mattered, that it would keep mattering, that the galaxy had looked at that face and then looked away, and that looking away would turn out to be the most expensive thing it had ever done. Outside my window, the conclave station turned slowly through the dark. Freighters moved between the docking arms. Council ships floated in their assigned berths, lights blinking in steady rhythms. Everything looked exactly as it always had. That was the last morning it ever would. The council sent a formal communiqué to the human mission 4 days after the broadcast. I was the one who received it, logged it, and placed it in the director's queue. It was 3 pages long and consisted primarily of legal citations. The core of it was simple. The council had acted within its jurisdiction. The matter was closed. Director Voss read it at his desk. He set it down. He asked me to file it under active correspondence. I filed it. I also made a personal copy, because Earth had told me to write down everything I saw. On the 8th day after the broadcast, I noticed the first thing. We had a standard resupply rotation with a freighter called the Calder Run, operated by a human crew out of a transit depot 2 relay jumps from Velorith. The Calder Run was supposed to dock at 1400 on the 8th day. It did not arrive. I checked the routing logs. The Calder Run had altered course 3 days prior. Its new destination was listed in the manifest as Depot 11, which was a human-operated way station I had never heard mentioned before. I noted it in my log. I did not ask questions. On the 12th day, 3 human technical advisors who had been stationed with the Council's Infrastructure Maintenance Division submitted their contract resignations. They cited Standard Clause 14C, which allowed for voluntary termination with 30 days' notice. They were polite about it. They gave no further reason. They left on the next available transport. The Council liaison who handled infrastructure matters filed a complaint through the usual channels. Director Voss acknowledged the complaint and noted that the resignations were legally consistent with the advisor's contract terms. On the 17th day, I attended a secondary trade negotiation between the Council's Economic Office and 3 outer system member species. I was there as a junior observer, one of those roles that exists mainly to put a human face in the room without giving it a voice. Midway through the session, the Council's lead negotiator referenced a shipping corridor pricing structure that was supposed to have been updated by the Joint Human Council Transit Authority the previous week. The update had not been filed. The negotiator looked at the human observer seat, which I occupied. I looked back at him with the careful, neutral expression I had spent 11 months learning to maintain. After the session, the negotiator's assistant approached me and asked, very politely, when the Human Transit Authority update would be submitted. I told her I would pass the inquiry to Director Voss's office. She thanked me. I noticed that she was moving slightly faster than usual, and that the loosening around her jaw plates was entirely absent. That night I wrote in my log for 2 hours. On the 23rd day, the human mission received a formal request from the Conclave Medical Cooperative, asking whether the human-operated pharmaceutical synthesis units on the outer station ring would be renewing their cooperative licensing agreement, which was set to expire in 11 days. Director Voss composed a reply himself. It was brief. He thanked the cooperative for the inquiry. He noted that the licensing decision would be under review, and that a response would be provided in due course. Due course, in diplomatic language, meant not yet. It also meant, we have noticed you are waiting, and we have decided that waiting is something you will do for a while. I filed the reply. I made a note of the pharmaceutical licensing agreement. I had not known it existed before that message. I was beginning to understand that there were a great many things I had not known existed. On the 27th day, the Council's second-ranking member, a figure known in the diplomatic logs as Councillor Orith, sent a personal communication to Director Voss. This was unusual. Councillors did not typically communicate with mission directors directly. They had liaisons for that. The fact that Orith had bypassed the liaison structure told me that something had shifted. The message expressed hope that the human mission was settling in, well following what Orith called the recent procedural event. It expressed confidence that both parties could move forward in a spirit of continued cooperation. It expressed particular interest in the status of the pharmaceutical licensing renewal and the Transit Authority filing. Director Voss read it. He dictated a response that thanked Councillor Orith for his personal attention and affirmed that the human mission was committed to responsible stewardship of all its cooperative obligations. He said that various internal reviews were ongoing. He said he hoped to provide more clarity on multiple matters in the coming weeks. He did not provide a timeline. He did not provide a number of weeks. When he finished dictating, he looked at me over the desk and said, "How many cooperative agreements does the mission currently have under review?" I had been keeping track. 41, I said. He nodded slowly. Good. Make sure they're all properly documented. I spent the next 3 days cross-referencing every human cooperative agreement, licensing contract, joint service arrangement, and co-signed infrastructure commitment currently active within the conclave. There were 41 flagged for review. There were also an additional 67 that had not yet been flagged. I flagged them. On the 31st day, I received a second-hand report from a human communications officer on a different conclave station, relayed through the mission's internal network. She said that the third-tier relay booster network in her sector, the one that processed about 60% of all short-range communication traffic between 18 member species, had undergone a routine firmware audit. The audit had found that the firmware was approaching end of support. The extension license, held by a human technology firm, had not been renewed. She said the local council administration had seemed confused about the situation. They had apparently believed the firmware would auto-renew, as it had done for the previous 9 years. It did not auto-renew. I wrote this down. On the 35th day, Director Voss called me into his office and closed the door. He sat down across from me, not behind his desk but in the chair beside it, which he had never done before. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been carrying something very heavy for a long time and are simply used to the weight. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to understand it clearly." I said I was listening. He said, "What is happening right now is not revenge. Revenge is when you hurt someone because you are angry. What is happening right now is accounting. We are simply withdrawing what was ours to begin with." I asked him how long it would take. He said, "Longer than the council expects. Shorter than they can survive." Then he opened his desk drawer and placed on the surface between us a single data chip. He said it was a copy of everything Earth had already cataloged about the Conclave's dependency on human infrastructure, services, and technical support. He said it had been in preparation for 3 years. He said the execution of Lyra San had not started this process. It had simply removed the last reason Earth had for not beginning it. I looked at the data chip for a long moment. I said, "She was 19. He said, "I know." Neither of us said anything after that for a while. Outside the window, a council enforcement vessel was moving through the docking lane. Its lights were on. Its engines were running. It looked powerful and permanent in the way that things look powerful and permanent right before you understand what they are actually built on. On the 41st day, 2 council member species filed a joint inquiry to the human mission, asking about the status of the agricultural licensing journey, renewal for the seed stock distribution network. The network supplied base grain synthesis templates to 11 outer system settlements across 4 species' home territories. The licensing renewal was under review. On the 48th day, a council-aligned shipping consortium sent a formal complaint to the mission regarding the closure of 3 human-operated fueling depots along the Count-Vel corridor. The depots had not been sabotaged. They had simply gone offline for maintenance. Extended maintenance. The consortium asked when they would reopen. The mission replied that a timeline was being determined. On the 52nd day, Councillor Orath sent a second message. This one was shorter. It did not express hope or confidence. It asked, in plain language, what the human mission required in order to resume normal operational cooperation. Director Voss composed a reply that was shorter still. He attached a document. The document was the invoice. It was itemized to 7 decimal places in 41 different recognized currency formats. It represented the calculated economic value of one human life, age 19, lost to a sanctioned directive on a station she had volunteered to serve on, in a system she had traveled to specifically, in order to help people who could not otherwise be reached. The invoice was marked unpaid. It was marked with a due date that was already passed. At the bottom, in simple language that required no diplomatic translation, it said that the human mission would be happy to discuss the resumption of cooperative services as soon as the outstanding balance was settled. I filed a copy of the invoice in my personal log. I also made a note of the date. The conclave, in 52 days, had not said her name once. Every document I filed, every communication I logged, every meeting I attended, I noted it in my records. I kept track of which agreements were under review. I kept track of which licenses had not been renewed. I kept track of how many days had passed since anyone on the council side had said the words Lyra San in any official capacity. The number on that last count kept going up. On the 58th day, I received a quiet communication from a colleague named Petra Aldam, a human cultural liaison stationed on a different part of the station. She said that several non-council species had begun asking questions, not loudly, not officially, but quietly, in the informal conversation spaces that existed around the edges of every formal diplomatic setting. People were starting to talk. They were noticing that the human personnel they had worked alongside for years were no longer there. They were noticing that certain systems were running slower, that certain services were delayed, that certain routes were less reliable. They were not yet connecting it to the broadcast, but they were beginning to ask why things felt different. I told Petra to keep listening. On the 63rd day, the Conclave's Central Logistics Office issued an internal memo, which was not supposed to be shared outside its original recipients, but which reached me through a chain of quiet sources I had been carefully building. The memo noted that 18 critical infrastructure systems across 6 sectors were currently operating on software frameworks that were either unlicensed, past their support end date, or flagged for renewal that had not yet been processed. The memo asked that the relevant departments contact their respective human counterpart offices to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. The relevant departments did contact the human counterpart offices. The human counterpart offices noted that all licensing and renewal matters were currently under review, and that they appreciated the inquiry, and that they would be in touch. On the 71st day, I stood at the window of the mission's small common room and looked out at Velorith Station in the early cycle light. A council administrative ship was moving out of the upper dock. 2 cargo haulers were maneuvering near the outer ring. Everything looked normal, but I had been writing things down for 71 days. And I knew that normal was a surface. Underneath it, something very old and very quiet was shifting. The galaxy had watched a 19-year-old girl die on camera. It had looked away. It had filed the footage under procedural event and moved on to the trade ledger. And humanity had simply stopped renewing its licenses. Not loudly, not with speeches or threats or a single raised voice. Just quietly, methodically. The way you withdraw your hand from something that has bitten it. The invoice sat in the council's correspondence queue, unpaid, the due date receding further into the past with every cycle. I wrote the day's entry in my log and went to bed. Outside, the station kept turning. The relay boosters transmitted their signals across the corridor. For now, the seed stock licenses remained in review. For now, the fueling depots stayed in maintenance. For now, 89 days remained in the window Director Voss had described to me. The window, he had said, was shorter than the council could survive. I was beginning to believe him. The thing no one tells you about infrastructure is that it is invisible until it is gone. I had spent most of my career in rooms full of people who talked about power in terms of ships and votes and economic leverage. They talked about who had the largest fleet in a given sector, and who held the majority block in the conclave assembly, and who controlled the trade routes along the major arteries. These were real things. They mattered, but they were the surface. Underneath the surface was the machinery, the actual machinery, the code that ran the relay boosters, the licensing frameworks that kept the synthesis networks online, the technical training that allowed certain critical systems to be maintained at all, the navigational knowledge that made certain corridors passable in certain seasons. No one talked about that machinery in diplomatic sessions. It did not fit into the language of power that everyone in those rooms had agreed to use. It was the kind of thing that junior technicians handled and senior officials signed off on without reading. I was, in my role as a junior diplomatic attaché, technically closer to the technician end of the spectrum than the official end. I had access to a great deal of paperwork that no one important wanted to read. I started reading all of it. By day 78, I had compiled a document that I privately called the Foundation Record. It was not an official document. It was my own work, done in the hours between my assigned duties, in the quiet of my quarters. It was a comprehensive list of every human-operated or human-licensed system currently active within the Conclave's jurisdiction, organized by type, by sector, and by what would happen if the license, service, or personnel commitment associated with it were not renewed. It was a long document. The relay booster network was the most immediate. Humanity had developed the dominant firmware architecture for short-range communication relays about 30 years ago, and because it was the best available option at the time, the Conclave had adopted it across approximately 62% of its communications infrastructure. The licensing for that firmware had, over the years, been quietly consolidated under a single human-owned technology consortium. The consortium had been faithfully renewing those licenses every 3 years. The most recent renewal cycle had passed 6 weeks ago. The consortium had submitted an internal review request instead of a renewal. The review was expected to take some time. The Pharmaceutical Synthesis Network was the second entry in my foundation record. Human biochemists had developed the base synthesis protocols for the Conclave's cooperative medical manufacturing network in the early years of humanity's Conclave membership, in the period when Earth was still trying to demonstrate its value. The protocols had been shared openly, as a gesture of good faith. What had not been shared openly was the maintenance expertise needed to run the manufacturing units at full efficiency. That expertise still lived almost exclusively in the heads and hands of a relatively small number of human technicians. 23 of those technicians had submitted contract resignations in the last 70 days. All resignations were legally consistent with their contract terms. All had cited Standard Clause 14C. None had given further explanation. The third major category was navigation. The Vel Corridor was the most efficient transit route between the Conclave's eastern and central sectors. 61% of all commercial traffic between those zones moved through it. The corridor had one significant complication: seasonal electromagnetic instability, which occurred for approximately 4 months out of every Conclave standard year. During those months, navigation through the corridor required piloting techniques that had been developed specifically by human crews over 20 years of practical experience. Human pilots could fly the corridor in storm season. The attrition rate for non-human pilots attempting it during those months sat at a level that most shipping companies considered unacceptable. Storm season began in 38 days. The fourth category was food supply, which was the one that made me sit back in my chair when I finished mapping it and look at the ceiling for a long time. 4 species with Conclave member status had, over the previous 15 years, transitioned significant portions of their agricultural infrastructure to seed stock synthesis systems operated under human licensing agreements. The transitions had made economic sense at the time. The human systems were cheaper to run, more yield efficient, and more resistant to environmental disruption. The licensing agreements for those systems were currently under review. I looked at what I had written, and I thought about the conversation I had with Director Voss on day 35, when he had placed the data chip on the desk between us and said that the process had been in preparation for 3 years. I thought about that differently now, because what I was looking at was not a response to Lyra-san's death. What I was looking at was a structure that had existed before her death, had been mapped and documented and understood in full before her death, and had simply been waiting. The execution had not created the leverage. The leverage had been built, quietly, over decades, by human engineers and technicians and scientists who had made themselves indispensable in ways that nobody in the Council's diplomatic chambers had bothered to examine. Lyra-san had not died to give Earth a weapon. Earth had already had the weapon. Her death had simply removed the reason to keep it holstered. On day 81, I attended a routine coordination meeting between the mission and the Conclave's Outer Station Administrative Office. The meeting was supposed to cover standard quarterly logistics, but before the agenda could begin, the Conclave's administrative coordinator, a figure I had interacted with many times and who had always been professionally pleasant, set down his notes and looked across the table at me. He said, directly, and, without the usual preamble, that there was significant concern within the Outer Station network about service disruptions. He said that several systems had been running on reduced capacity. He said that the non-renewal of certain licenses had created, in his words, structural uncertainty. I said that I understood his concern. I said that the mission was aware of the various outstanding items, and that they were being addressed through internal review processes. I said that I would ensure his concerns were noted in the meeting record. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Is this about the medic?" The word medic hit the air between us and just sat there. I said, "I'm not in a position to characterize the mission's internal review processes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded and picked up his notes, and we went through the quarterly logistics agenda, item by item, as if he had not just asked the most direct question anyone on the Conclave side had managed in 81 days. After the meeting, I went back to my quarters and added his question to my log. He had said the medic, not Lyra-san, not the human medic, just the medic, as if he had been carrying the word around and needed to set it down somewhere. I wrote that down too. On day 87, two things happened. The first was that a non-council member species, the Verath, filed a formal inquiry through the Conclave's Internal Records Office, asking whether the Pharmaceutical Synthesis Licensing Review had a projected completion date. The Verath had 4 settlements in the outer corridor that sourced 68% of their medical supplies through the cooperative network. The inquiry was polite and bureaucratic in tone, but underneath the formal language, the urgency was audible to anyone paying attention. The second thing was that a senior human communications specialist named Owen Hartley, who had been stationed at the main relay hub on the station's communications tier for 4 years, submitted his resignation. Owen was one of 7 human specialists who maintained the hub's primary processing architecture. The architecture ran on the human-developed firmware. Owen was one of the 3 people on the station who fully understood how to troubleshoot it and, when it developed problems, he cited Standard Clause 14C. He was very polite about it. By day 90, the Conclave's internal situation had developed a particular texture that I could feel in every corridor I walked through, and every meeting room I entered. It was the texture of people who were beginning to understand something they did not want to understand. It was not panic. Not yet. But it was the thing that comes before panic, the specific quality of attention that a person develops when they begin to notice that the ground under their feet is not as solid as they believed. The Council of 7 had not yet publicly acknowledged that anything was wrong. They were still conducting sessions. They were still processing routine administrative matters. The trade ledger was still being updated. The asteroid belt dispute was still being managed. But the liaisons were moving faster. The messages were arriving more frequently. The tone of the communications was shifting in subtle ways that were clear to someone who had spent 11 months learning how to read the space between diplomatic words. On day 93, Councillor Orath sent a third message. This one did not express hope or ask polite questions. It said, in language that was still formal but had lost its previous comfort, that the Council wished to open a dialogue regarding the outstanding invoice and the status of cooperative agreements. Director Voss read it. He sat with it for a long time. Then he wrote a reply that said, the human mission would be glad to receive any Council delegation that wished to discuss the outstanding matters, and that it could make time available at the Council's earliest convenience, and that it looked forward to a productive dialogue. He said nothing about what the dialogue would produce. He said nothing about timelines. He said nothing about what would happen if the dialogue was not in fact productive. He did not need to. I filed the reply. I noted the date. Then I went back to my Foundation record and updated it with the latest entries. The Relay Booster License Review was now 93 days old. Storm season in the Vel corridor was 31 days away. The Pharmaceutical Synthesis Network was running at 74% capacity. 14 of the 18 flagged infrastructure systems were now showing measurable performance degradation. I thought about what Director Voss had said on day 35, that what was happening was not revenge, that it was accounting. I understood that better now. The Council had executed a 19-year-old girl on camera. They had sent the footage to every station in the Conclave as a message. The message had been, humanity has no recourse. The message had been, we can do this and nothing will change. They had believed that because they had never looked at what was under their feet. They had never looked at the firmware. They had never looked at the seed stock licenses. They had never looked at the list of human pilots qualified to navigate a storm season corridor. They had never looked at who actually maintained the systems they depended on, because that kind of looking required admitting that the things you depended on had been built and were sustained by people you had decided were beneath your attention. The galaxy had looked away from Lyra San's face. Now it was looking at everything it could not run without her people. I thought those two things were related. Outside the station window, a cargo hauler was coming in from the Vel corridor, one of the last of the season probably. In 31 days, human pilots would stop flying that route, not because they were ordered to, but because their contracts were up and the renewal paperwork was caught in a review that had no projected completion date. The hauler docked without incident. Its running lights blinked once and went dark. I wrote it all down. On day 97, 6 of the 12 non-council species sent a joint communication to the human mission. It was not addressed to Director Voss. It was addressed to the mission itself, meaning it was addressed to all of us, which was an unusual choice. The 6 species were the Verath, the Orani, the Dunshi, the Pale Communion of Keth, the Solvar, and a species whose common name in the diplomatic record was simply the Marsh Collective. The communication was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expressed formal solidarity with the human community in the wake of what it called the incident regarding the human medical worker. This was the first time any official conclave communication from any member species had used language that acknowledged the execution as an incident rather than a directive. The second paragraph noted that several member species were experiencing service disruptions that were causing measurable harm to their populations. The third paragraph asked whether a formal assembly session could be arranged to address both matters together. I read it 3 times. Then I walked it directly to Director Voss's office without sending it through the queue. He read it once. He set it down. He looked at the wall for a moment, in the way he sometimes did when he was thinking something through entirely. Then he said, "Set up the session. Give me 48 hours to prepare." I booked the assembly chamber for day 99. It was a larger room than the one the council normally used, which was deliberate. The council's regular chamber was designed to seat 7 voices and 14 observers. The conclave's full assembly chamber was designed for the entire membership. The Council of 7 arrived with their full formal staff. They did not look pleased about the venue, but they could not object to it without acknowledging that they had expected a smaller audience. They sat in the semicircular upper tier, which was the traditional seating for presiding authority. The 6 co-signatory species sat below them, which was also traditional. The human delegation sat at the testimony position, which placed us at the center of the room, facing everyone. I had attended dozens of assembly sessions in 11 months. I had always sat in the observer section. I had never sat at the testimony position. Director Voss sat at the center of the table. I sat to his right. Petra Aldum sat to his left. Behind us, 2 junior staffers were arranged in support positions. The convening speaker, a figure from one of the neutral species whose role was procedural rather than political, opened the session and read the formal notice. This was a session called under Article 17 of the Conclave Charter, which allowed any consortium of 4 or more member species to convene a general assembly for the purpose of addressing matters of shared material concern. The chair recognized that 2 matters had been jointly submitted: the status of cooperative service agreements with the Human Continuance Mission and the circumstances surrounding the execution of human national liaison. The council's lead voice objected immediately. She said that the second matter was a closed procedural event that had been handled in full accordance with Conclave Directive 7 Theta. She said it was not appropriate for assembly discussion. The speaker noted the objection. He noted that the session had been validly convened under Article 17. He said the floor was open. Director Voss did not stand to speak. He sat at the table, and he placed a data reader in front of him, and he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that the room had to lean slightly forward to hear him clearly, "I would like to read from the public record." He did not ask for permission. He simply began. He had been preparing for 48 hours, and what he had prepared was not an argument. It was a reading. He read from the council's own session transcripts, in sequence, going back 11 years. He read the votes. Each vote was summarized in 2 or 3 sentences. What the vote had concerned, which species had been affected, what the outcome had been. He read without editorializing. He read without raising his voice. He read for 40 minutes. By the time he stopped, the chamber was very quiet. I had read parts of the record in my own preparation, but hearing it read aloud was different. Hearing it read in sequence, one item after another, in a flat and careful voice, had a cumulative weight that no individual item could have produced on its own. It was the weight of pattern. It was the weight of a thing that looked like a series of separate decisions until you heard them together, at which point they resolved into something that had always been a single continuous decision made over and over again. The council's lead voice began to respond. She was articulate. She cited the legal frameworks. She used the word necessary several times. She used the phrase within jurisdiction 4 times. The speaker let her finish. Then he said the floor was open for questions from member representatives. What happened next was the part I had not anticipated. The questions did not come from the 6 co-signatories. The first question came from the Solvar representative, who had not been part of the initial filing, but had attended as an observer. She asked the council's voice a single question. She asked whether Directive 7 Theta had ever been applied to a member species citizen before the case of Lyra Son. The council's voice said that the directive applied to all individuals within sanctioned jurisdictions. The Solver representative asked again. More specifically, had a citizen of a full conclave member species ever previously been subject to the directive? There was a pause. The answer, which the council's voice gave after that pause, was no. The next question came from the Orani. The question was about the Vel Corridor. The Orani had 8 settlements dependent on Vel Corridor shipping. They asked whether the human mission could confirm the status of human pilot, contracts for storm season navigation. I answered that one. I said, in the same quiet tone Director Voss had used, that all relevant contracts were currently under review. I said that I was not able to provide a projected completion date. The Orani representative wrote something on her notepad. She did not look up. The next 12 questions came in rapid succession from 7 different representatives. They concerned, in order, the relay booster firmware licenses, the pharmaceutical synthesis network capacity, the agricultural seed stock agreements for 4 specific settlement groups, the maintenance staffing for the Outer Station Repair Division, the status of the joint medical archive that Lyra Son had been transmitting data to at the time of her death, the legal standing of Directive 7 Theta, with respect to non-jurisdictional citizens, the voting record of the Council on 3 specific motions related to species protections over the previous 6 years, the number of human personnel who had resigned their conclave positions in the past 90 days, the operational status of the Depot 11 way station, the question of whether the human mission had received any formal communication from the Council regarding the execution prior to the broadcast, and finally, from a representative I had not previously heard speak in any session, a quiet and precise question about whether the invoice that had been sent to the Council's correspondence office had received any response. I answered the last one myself. I said the invoice remained outstanding. I said it was unpaid. I said the amount and the currency formats, and the due date, which was now 97 days in the past. The chamber absorbed that for a moment. Then the Solvar representative asked to be recognized. She stood. She said that in light of the record as read and the questions as answered, the Solvar contingent wished to formally co-sign the original motion. She said that the motion, as she understood it, was to convene a formal review of the Council of Seven's authority and its application of Directive 7 Theta, with the aim of determining whether the Council had exceeded its mandate. Director Voss said, from his seat, without standing, without raising his voice, the human mission supports that motion. The speaker called for a count. The vote was not unanimous. 3 species abstained. 1 species voted against, citing concern about the precedent of reviewing executive authority. But 7 species voted in favor. Then an 8th. Then a 9th. The motion passed. I sat at the testimony table and watched the council tier. The 7 voices were speaking quietly among themselves. Their body language was careful and controlled in the way that very experienced political figures become careful and controlled when they are recalculating everything very quickly. They did not look afraid, exactly, but they looked like people who had just understood something they had not understood before, and who were trying to determine how long they had not understood it, and whether that duration was recoverable from. I did not think it was. After the session adjourned, as the chamber was emptying, the Orani representative stopped beside me. She was small, and she spoke quietly, and she had a way of moving that suggested she was always listening for something just at the edge of hearing. She said, the medic, the one who was transmitting the data. What was she transmitting? I said, survival records. Population health data for a community that was being reduced. She was trying to preserve their existence in any form she could reach. The Orani representative was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she succeeded? I said, the archive she transmitted to is intact. The data is preserved. She nodded slowly. She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, her name was Lyra Son. It was not a question. It was something else. I said, yes. Her name was Lyra Son. The Orani representative nodded again. Then she walked away through the emptying chamber, and I stood at the testimony table for a moment longer, and I wrote the exchange down in my mind, before I had the chance to lose any part of it. Her name was Lyra Son. Someone had finally said it out loud. The formal review process was assigned to a 5-species oversight panel. It had a 90-day mandate. It had subpoena authority over council records going back 20 years. It had 3 human observers, of which I was one. Director Voss had nominated me personally. He said it was because I had the most complete personal record of events since the broadcast. He said my log would be useful. He also said, and this was the part he said quietly, that the panel needed someone who could sit in a room with the full council record and not flinch, and read it aloud if necessary, and keep their voice level the entire time. I said I could do that. He said he knew. The first session of the oversight panel convened on day 102. The Council of 7 were required by the motion to provide complete access to their administrative records. They complied. I do not think they had a choice at that point, and I also think they had expected the records to be more defensible than they were. When you believe your authority is legitimate, you do not always scrutinize your own paperwork very carefully. Their paperwork was not defensible. The Directive 7 Theta application logs alone spanned 12 years and 49 separate uses. The oversight panel's primary archivist, a Varath scholar named something that I pronounced as Oren, began cataloging them on the first day. By the end of the second day, Oren had flagged 9 applications where the sanctioned jurisdiction designation appeared to have been applied retroactively. By the end of the first week, the count was 16. I sat in those sessions every day. I listened, I made notes. I asked questions when the panel chair invited questions. On day 109, the panel received a request from an unexpected source. A legal collective representing 4 species who had not been part of the original motion asked to submit evidence. They had records, they said, of interactions with the council going back 18 years. The panel chair granted access. The records were substantial. I spent 3 evenings reading them in the archive room. They documented, in very careful and thoroughly cross-referenced language, a pattern of decisions that the conclave's formal record had classified as routine administrative enforcement. What they looked like in the collective submission was something else. They looked like a series of choices, made repeatedly over many years, to prioritize the interests of council member species over all others, and to use the formal language of jurisdiction and directive to provide those choices with the appearance of legality. One of the cases in the submission involved a population event on a moon in the Dunori corridor. It was logged in the council's record as a sanctioned reduction under Directive 7 Theta. It had occurred 4 months before Lyra San arrived at Outpost Marath 7. The submission included testimony from survivors who had been evacuated before the directive was fully carried out. Survivors who were alive because a human medic had transmitted their biological data to an archive before the enforcement vessel completed its operation. I sat with that page for a long time. She had known. Lyra Son, 19 years old, stationed at a small relay outpost near a corridor she had volunteered to serve in, had understood what was happening, and had done the one thing she could do. She had made a record. She had said, "These people existed, and here is the proof, and I am sending it somewhere you cannot reach." The enforcement vessel had completed its operation. The archive existed. The data was intact. The oversight panel did not have the archive yet, but I knew it existed. I had confirmed it in the assembly chamber, and I knew that when the panel received it, the name Lyra Son would appear in the provenance record as the individual who had transmitted the data, and that would mean her name was in the formal record of an event that the council had classified as complete and closed. The council had been wrong about that too. On day 121, Director Voss called a meeting of the full mission staff. We sat in the common room, all 14 of us who remained on the station, and he told us what the review process had been finding and what its trajectory suggested. He said the panel was expected to conclude within its 90-day mandate, that the Council of 7 had systematically exceeded its authority over a period of approximately 14 years. He said the most probable formal outcome was a motion to dissolve the Council's executive mandate and redistribute its functions to a reformed body with significantly narrower authority and a broader member species representation structure. A junior logistics coordinator named Felice Hardman asked whether the council would comply with a dissolution motion. Director Voss said the council's compliance was no longer entirely necessary. He said that 6 species had already begun informally restructuring their governance relationships around the assumption that the Council's authority was ending. He said that 3 major shipping consortiums had quietly shifted their contract frameworks to reflect the same assumption. He said that the relay booster firmware had been brought back online under new licensing terms negotiated directly with the Human Technology Consortium, and that those terms did not go through the Council's administrative office. He said the world was reorganizing itself around a different shape than the one the Council had occupied. I asked about the cooperative agreements that were still under review. He said they would be resolved when there was a governing body capable of settling the outstanding invoice. Felice asked how long that would take. Director Voss said it would take as long as it needed to take. On day 135, the oversight panel submitted its preliminary findings. The document was 340 pages long. I was not the primary author, but I had contributed to 27 sections, and the personal log I had been keeping since the day after the broadcast was cited in the evidentiary appendix 41 times. The preliminary findings confirmed, in formal language and with extensive citation, that the Council of Seven had engaged in a sustained pattern of authority exceeding its chartered mandate. The findings specifically addressed the application of Directive 7 Theta to a citizen of a full member species, and found that application to have been both procedurally irregular and without precedent. The findings did not use the word unlawful, because the legal framework was complex and still being analyzed, but they did use the word unjustified 7 times. The preliminary findings were distributed to all member species. The formal session to consider them was scheduled for day 152. On day 148, 4 days before the session, the Council of Seven submitted a collective communication to the conclave record. It was the first formal statement they had made since the assembly session on day 99. It was long, and it was careful, and it cited many things, and it used the word jurisdiction a great many times. But at the end of it, in a paragraph that I read 4 times to make sure I had understood it correctly, it acknowledged that the execution of the human national Lyra San had, in retrospect, been carried out in a manner that had not fully considered the potential for misapplication of the relevant directive. They did not say her name. They said the human national. They said the individual in question. They said the case that has been the subject of subsequent review. They did not say her name. I noted that in my log. On day 152, the formal session to consider the preliminary findings opened in the full assembly chamber. All member species were present. Every seat was filled. I had attended many sessions in this room, but I had never seen it this full. Even the observer galleries, which were usually half empty, were occupied. The session ran for 9 hours. The formal vote on the findings was not the end of it. The vote confirmed the findings. Then a motion was submitted to establish a transition authority for the Council's functions. Then a motion was submitted to formally terminate the Council's executive mandate pending transition completion. Then a motion was submitted to establish a reformed body with new charter terms, broader representation, and explicit written limitations on the application of any directive against a citizen of a full member species. Each motion was voted on separately. Each motion passed. I sat at the observer table through all 9 hours. I did not speak. My role in this session was to observe and record, which was the role I had been performing since the day I sat in the communications room at 0300 and opened a priority read transmission. When the final motion passed, the convening speaker announced the result and then, as was traditional, called for a moment of formal acknowledgement of the circumstances that had led to the session. He read from the record. He said that the session had been convened in part as a response to the death of Lyra San, human national medical volunteer, age 19, on enforcement vessel track logged under conclave record reference 447-Theta Marath. He said her name. In the full assembly chamber, with every member species present, in the formal session record that would be archived and preserved and referenced for as long as the conclave maintained its records, the convening speaker said the name Lyra San. I looked down at my notes. I had written the name many times over 152 days. It looked the same on the page as it always had. I thought about the footage, the 47 seconds, the corridor of the enforcement vessel, the torn shoulder of a medic's uniform, the expression that I had spent 152 days looking for words to describe. She had not begged. She had not argued. She had transmitted the data, and she had looked at the camera, and she had been calm, with the kind of calm that knew everything there was to know about the situation. She had known she was being recorded. She had known the broadcast would go out. She had known that the footage would be seen. I wonder, sometimes, if she had also known what the footage would eventually cost them. I think she might have. After the session, after the chamber had emptied and the formal record had been sealed, and the transition authority had been officially seated, I walked back to the mission offices alone. The corridors of Velareth were quiet at that hour. A cleaning unit moved along the far end of the hall, its brushes making a soft sound against the floor panels. I sat at my desk, and I opened my personal log, and I wrote the final entry for day 152. I wrote what had been said, what had been voted, what the session had formally concluded. Then I wrote, at the bottom of the page, in the same plain language I had used for every entry, the invoice remains unpaid. No currency transaction has been processed. No formal settlement has been offered. Because that was still true. The council was gone. The authority was dissolved. The new body was seated, and its new charter was being drafted, and the governance structure of the conclave was reorganizing itself around a shape that was broader and more carefully bounded than the one before it. But Lyra-san was still dead, and I still had the invoice in my files, marked with a due date 152 days in the past, and the balance was still outstanding, and I intended to make sure it was presented to the new body as the first item of business. Not because money could settle it. It could not. But because the new compact needed to begin somewhere. It needed to begin with an acknowledgement that a 19-year-old girl had volunteered to go somewhere hard and help people who could not be reached, and that she had done her job, and that the record of the people she had saved existed and would be preserved, and that her name would appear in the first page of the new charter as the reason it had been written. She would be there at the beginning of the thing that came after. That was the only settlement that made any sense. I wrote it down. I closed my log. Down the corridor, Director Voss's office light was still on. Through the small window in his door, I could see him at his desk, reading something. He had been at his desk for most of the past 152 days, doing the quiet and relentless work of accounting, of documentation, of making sure that everything that had happened was recorded correctly and completely. I did not knock. He was working, and so was I. I went back to my desk and I began drafting the cover letter for the invoice. It would be addressed to the Transition Authority. It would be the first formal communication submitted to the new body by the Human Continuance Mission. It would begin with her name, Lyra-san, age 19, medical volunteer, Outpost Marath 7. She had looked at the camera and she had been calm, and the galaxy had decided that nothing would change, and the galaxy had been wrong. The new compact would know why. I typed her name at the top of the page and kept writing.